So in our processes, the N2O goes right to the atmosphere. So the existing technologies at a nitric acid plant would do nothing to oxidize N2O, nitrogen, N2O, nitrous oxide. So, it is currently 270, I say currently because IPCC changes GWPs, but currently it's 273 times more potent than CO2 on a per ton basis in the atmosphere.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, and I say, it's not short. This isn't a short-lived super-pollutant, though. You had mentioned earlier, this is a century long. So whatever gas we can get at and destroy today, it's helping us out for the next 100 years. So it is a long term, which is why initially sometimes some of the definition of super-pollutants, if they were only looking at short term, didn't include N2O. We really changed that narrative.
All right, welcome back to This Week in Carbon. Today, I'm joined by Bill Flederbach, founder and president and CEO of ClimeCo. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rene. Great. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Now, I've known you and the ClimeCo team for quite some time, and we've got enormous respect for what you've built and the depth of expertise across the business. You've also said, generally great team. Dan Linsky is someone that we've worked with on many deals for well over a decade, and he remains one of Nick, my business partner, and my favorite people in the market. And I'm also close with Anna Stablum, who's based here in Singapore and leads your team here in Singapore. Anna and I have got a bit of a running joke that despite that we're living in the same city, we only ever seem to catch up with one another at conferences, or ironically, when our families bump into each other over the school holidays. And in sort of an unexpected way, this episode kind of came about because our families happen to be at the same resort in Bintan in Indonesia. One afternoon, I was in the pool with my daughter, and then Anna's children basically joined us in the pool, and we spent an afternoon splashing around and building rafts out of inflatable pool toys. And then shortly afterwards, Dan actually sent me a message with a photo saying he'd seen photos of me splashing in the pool with Anna's kids, which I thought was hilarious. And then it began a kind of conversation, yeah. and then that sort of kicked off this deeper conversation around the work that you guys are doing, specifically around super pollutants and N2O particularly. And I thought that sort of built upon an earlier conversation that we had on this show about super pollutants. And I think it was in May. And so basically in summary, yeah, this episode is kind of inspired by just happenstance and kind of just luck, but also curiosity, wanted to sort of do a deeper dive.
Yeah, we're going to have fun today, but maybe not as much fun as you were when you were splashing in the pool with the kid.
Yeah, it was a bit funny when Dan's like, "Hey, I heard that you were playing with Dan's kids," and then a photo floated around. I was like, "Oh my God, and you didn't share the photo, did you?" She did, which is pretty fun.
Yeah.
But sort of picking up this topic around super pollutants, I had Fritz Troller from Therm, and he was on the show, and we talked about super pollutants, and he talked about sort of the hidden gigaton, right? And the enormous climate impact of super pollutants. And specifically, he focused on methane, refrigerants, and ozone depleting substances. But today, I really wanted to narrow that aperture and focus on another super pollutant, which is extraordinarily potent and remains in the atmosphere for more than a century. It damages the ozone layer and is still largely absent from mainstream climate discussions and conversations, and that's nitrous oxide, or N2O. And ClimeCo has become effectively a recognized leader in the industrial N2O abatement, developing and financing projects that destroy these emissions at chemical manufacturing facilities across the US and internationally. So Bill, let's begin there with a basic question. Firstly, what is nitrous oxide? Where does it come from? And why has it got such a consequential greenhouse gas sort of impact, and why has it remained so easy for the climate community to overlook it?
Yeah, thanks, Rene. 18 years ago, I always say, to entrepreneurs, what's your beachhead? What's your focus area? And our focus area when we started the business back in 2009 was the scale of N2O reduction. So, we've diversified a lot. Our team has grown. We do a lot of things. But still the foundation of ClimeCo is our leadership in nitrous oxide. And so where we focus, and a lot of that focus, Rene, was when I was before ClimeCo, when I was in the international Kyoto world back in the day, as we say. I was working with a company that was doing methane, but they were doing methane abatement on swine farms throughout Brazil and Mexico and palm oil plants in Malaysia. They were all relatively small size, and they had a lot of country risk, build risk, riddled with risk. And where I wanted to go with super pollutants is focus on scale. Like, where can I get to N2O at scale? So when we started the business in 2009, we started to focus primarily on N2O from nitric acid plants. We all realized that, years ago, HFCs and N2O from adipic were prevalent gases that under the CDM that were rightfully scrutinized. So when we started the business in the US, we wanted to go at nitric acid. We wanted to go at ammonium nitrate production where nitric acid is used and N2O is emitted. Also in ammonia nitrate, that's also an explosive. So in the mining industry, they're producing nitric acid for mining. So again, very similar source.
Right.
And then also, as an intermediate chemical. So our main focus initially were nitric acid plants across the United States. Let's be a leader in the United States. And we were doing that since 2000. I think our first project went live, Rene, in 2010. But to get to that point, we did have to do that heavy lifting of there's no protocol. We had to find a registry in the early days and invest a couple years of our time with zero revenue, to create a credible protocol, learning from our lessons internationally where we saw the benefit of the CDM executive board protocols, but we also saw gaps in them. So we took what was existing there and we brought those into the Climate Action Reserve. And our first protocol was actually launched in 2010, which is the nitric acid protocol. Since then, we went into bigger scale yet, right? We went into nylon 6,6 plants. This is your classic adipic acid. I always like to say, where do we touch adipic acid? Everywhere. In your computer, you have nylon 6,6. In your electric car or your gas car, you have performance plastic. It's what makes a car lighter. It covers the engine. It's in all parts of the vehicle. Nylon 6,6 is in our sports gear. It's in our clothing gear. It's in our carpets. It's in our shirts. It's in every airbag that protects our lives, right? So it's everywhere and it's only scaling. So later in the ClimeCo career, in our ClimeCo history, we decided to tackle N2O from adipic acid as well. And we can get into that together. And that's both in the US. And then since we started tackling N2O in the US, we went pretty seriously mission focused into India and China as well.
That's fascinating. And thanks for that context setting, because obviously, like you said, it's ubiquitous in so many different products, right? Like you mentioned, right? It's used in fabrics and, but it's industrial product processes and fertilizers, nylon, everything. And so it's obviously something that's kind of just there, but not obvious to a lot of folks. Just let's kind of go back to first principles and talk about it. Why does it qualify as a super pollutant specifically? Because it's got a greenhouse warming potential that is 100 times more than CO2. Can you just kind of give us some of the kind of chemistry behind it?
You bet. So in our processes, the N2O goes right to the atmosphere. So the existing technologies at a nitric acid plant would do nothing to oxidize N2O, nitrogen, N2O, nitrous oxide. So, it is currently 270, I say currently because IPCC changes GWPs, but currently it's 273 times more potent than CO2 on a per ton basis in the atmosphere.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah. And I say, it's not short. This isn't a short-lived super pollutant though. You had mentioned earlier, this is a century long. So whatever gas we can get at and destroy today, it's helping us out for the next 100 years. So it is a long term, which is why initially sometimes some of the definition of super pollutants, if they were only looking at short term, didn't include N2O. We really changed that narrative.
Okay. And so thank you for that. And that context is really important, right? So super pollutant in terms of its global warming potential and also like in terms of how long it stays in the atmosphere, which is significant.
Yeah.
So like, let's now bring it back down to, you sort of walked us through sort of the typical nitric acid and adipic acid like processes in plants. But at what point in the manufacturing process is N2O created? And then more specifically, how's it captured and then destroyed?
Yeah. So it's a little different in both processes. And I think, in some ways I like to keep it really simple because people understand what like a catalytic converter is for a car, Rene. In essence, we're putting a catalytic converter in a petrochemical process. So when you think
that's a very eloquent kind of analogy there. I like that.
It's more complicated than that, but it's simple. It's a catalyst, right? So when we're thinking about like the fertilizer that I may put on my lawn in Houston, that fertilizer is produced through taking ammonia and taking that ammonia and air mixture and putting it over a gauze under high temperatures and breaking that down into nitrogen compounds. That's what you want in ammonia nitrate. The nitrate is ammonia, so it is nitrogen. So you're taking ammonia in air, you're over a high temperature gauze, you're breaking that down into nitrogen components. One of the inadvertent nitrogen components that you get and you don't want is N2O, because N2O is not soluble in water. So all the other nitrogen components get mashed with water in a high temperature, and it converts to nitric acid. N2O is not water soluble, so it just passes right to the atmosphere. So everything in a typical plant focuses on creating NO and other nitrogen products. They try to avoid nitrous oxide, but it's unavoidable, and it goes directly to the atmosphere. Where we come in is we say, okay, that's an unwanted pollutant. It's not regulated. You don't have technologies to destroy it, but we do have technologies. And I always said to Rene, we always wanted to be agnostic to the technology, because every nitric acid plant was built differently, so not one fits all. So the technology isn't ours. The technology could be Shell or BASF or Johnson Matthey or others, but we're an integrator. So we know which catalyst fit what processes, and then we'll build the reactor or help our clients build the reactor, design it, and fit that catalyst in where it needs to be situated in the process. And essentially, we're destroying N2O where it was passing to the atmosphere. So I think there's a lot of different technologies, so I don't want to get too complicated in technologies, but at the end of the day, it's just a catalyst that preferentially destroys or oxidizes nitrogen and oxygen. And in the end, the breakdown of that is nitrogen and oxygen like you and I breathe. So it breaks nitrous oxide into nitrogen and oxygen. And it's not reversible. So once it's destroyed, nitrogen and oxygen in the atmosphere can't come back to form N2O, right? So we always in our business, we like to talk about permanence in reverse risks. Well, there's zero reversal risks here, right? Once we destroy it, it's destroyed.
Yeah. Okay. And it effectively two inert gases, essentially. I mean, oxygen is not necessarily but like harmless in terms of greenhouse gas warming potential. So that's good in terms of context, and the fact that it is non-reversible, that's great. So I guess obviously, like you said, N2O is this unwanted byproduct of the adipic and nitric acid like industrial processes. There's the destruction of it. Obviously, like you said, right? It's custom and there's technologies, and so there's obviously investment that's required in terms of fitting out each one of these plants. I'd like to now kind of flip it now to sort of our area of focus, which is on the carbon financing side. So, how does the carbon financing help effectively make these projects viable? And then ultimately, I've got questions that follow on in terms of the ensuing carbon credits that come from this.
There's no other benefit other than carbon. It doesn't make their process more efficient. Really, when we started this business, Rene, we were going into very bipartisan states, very Republican states in the U.S., mostly the petrochemical states tend to be Republican. I would always go in, and we know our Republican friends are very supportive of typically, historically, capital markets to solve problems. So we would go into petrochemical states and say, we don't really care if you believe in climate change or not, but do you believe in a good business model? Do you believe that, having
I'm
going
to steal that line.
Yeah. Do you believe in positive rate of return to doing the right thing? And so we were never there to convince. And Dan and I, you talk about Dan Linsky, we go back, 20 years now, Dan and I, but we never showed a melting iceberg to one of our clients. They really didn't care about that, honestly, most of them, not all of them, but most of them at that time. So we went in and said, hey, before it's regulated, we're a market maker. There's no market for this today, but we have the technologies. We can install this. We have the know-how. Trust us. So, we had to work with the first couple customers that we were a brand new company in 2009. We had to show them that we could do what we said we're going to do. So we had a couple of great customers that trusted us, that were a launch pad. And then we not only destroyed it, but we created a market for it. So we told our clients, we can do this. We believe that in a certain amount of years, you'll get a positive rate of return. These are 10 or 20-year offtakes. Trust us, but let's use the markets to do this, because if you're not moving now, you're going to be at a disadvantage later. Not only is the equipment going to cost more, but Rene, years ago in the United States, we actually believed that the EPA would one day regulate this. So we used to tell our clients, get ahead of the regulation, destroy it now into the voluntary carbon market, so you can get the equipment paid for, and it's a competitive advantage for you. Now, unfortunately, in the U.S., there's never been a regulation for N2O. So without the
which is kind of crazy,
it's so,
that there hasn't been one.
it's been. I mean, we all have seen and we do a lot of work in other countries now, but certainly in the US under the Obama administration, there was the Clean Power Plan, there was a focus on federal cap and trade. And then the EPA tried to attack greenhouse gases, and a lot of that just got caught up in the courts. So at the end of the day, there is no other revenue stream associated with N2O abatement. It's the only.
But it's clearly necessary, because otherwise, like you said, this incredibly long-lived and super powerful pollutant in terms of greenhouse gas warming potential is just entering into the atmosphere. So it's necessary. So then, okay. So I want to dive, before I get into sort of the market making component and build upon the legacy of the clean development mechanism. Can you give me some context about that process? I think you said, you spent a number of years without any revenue, just building out this market. So that's the foundation that underpins the underlying credits. I'd like to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that'd be great. I hope we don't have to write another protocol from scratch, Rene.
Yeah, it's an ambitious process, right?
Yeah, and you talked about that with your other with some of your other podcasts as well. But it's essential, and I think so. When we started the business, because we were U.S. centric, we wanted to select a registry that was really a dominant registry in the U.S. So we did work. We started to work with the Climate Action Reserve, but that process of taking protocols and work done internationally and then integrating them into the U.S. Typically, the way that works, Rene, is that we're these primary. We take pen to it initially. We work with the registries to say, are you supportive of a methodology like N2O? Does it have the scale that you could support? Is it important enough for you? But usually the heavy lifting is done initially by, at least in all of our N2O work, by ClimeCo. But then the way the process works, and I really think this is important, is that we turn that over then to the registry. We have the chemical engineering experts. We have the process expertise to write this protocol. We have the expertise in writing all of the MRV process, the continuous monitoring of the system. How are we going to collect data on a minute by minute average in these chemical plants? We put all that together, but then we hand that over. And then I always like to say, what's great about the process of a registry is that we become a member of the work group, but we no longer have the pen. The pen now is at the registry, and the registry puts other stakeholders in it. So it's not a ClimeCo protocol anymore. We're a contributor. So I think it's a really important process. I would say the biggest one that we tackled, Rene, is taking on, years later, adipic acid. So it all started with we had one client in the United States that had technologies installed at the plant that inadvertently destroyed 80% of their N2O. We work with them on technology to get them to 99.99%, 49 destruction. That 80% to 99.99 results in over 5 million tons of abatement annually. So this is the largest source of greenhouse gases, single point source in the United States. So we decided to write a protocol and spend about two years. So I was like, I thought the definition of insanity was doing the same thing over again. Like, I did this in 2009. Why am I doing this again in 2016 or whenever we started this process? I think it was like 2019. But we did it because the scale of just this one facility said it's worth it. It's worth it to do this. And so that was even more challenging because we had to take a lot of the scars on the adipic acid protocol internationally, learn from all of that, and then make a decision. Can we write a quality protocol that ClimeCo is comfortable putting our brand on? Our brand means everything to us. So if we're going to do this, we have to do it right. So we put pen to paper, and that was about a 2-year process as well, Rene. And then not only that, then we took that protocol and we took it to China, which we can talk about. So
I'd love to do that deeper dive in terms of the global expansion for sure. Okay. But let's continue this thread around the kind of the building of the foundation with the methodologies.
Yeah. So we built it off of the U.S. potential, just off that one plant. There's only two adipic acid plants in the United States. Most of the adipic acid is in China. So when we were writing it for the U.S., we always had that idea, let's go back to China and do it right this time. And a lot of the Chinese plants were being built with zero control. So one of the things that we did with our China protocol is we took the heart of what we created and then gave to the Climate Action Reserve to author. So again, we were a work group member of the adipic acid protocol. Once we turned it over, that's a really important process. And then we told Climate Action Reserve, you're in North America right now. You're doing work in Mexico. I'm not sure they were doing work in Canada yet at this point. I said, but we've got a wild idea. why don't we take our leadership and go to China? And I think I got a look from Craig. Craig, you were like, well, that's interesting. Now Craig's retired, of course, and Robin's doing a great job at Climate Action Reserve. But he looked at me like, okay, I think we can do this. I think we can tell our board that we believe we can create real scale and credibility in China. So we put together a work group in China. So now we didn't have AI tools at the time, so we had to use translators to translate an 80-page very technical document over to Mandarin. And then we put the work group together in China, and we created a China protocol. And what we did in China, though, is that we were very clear that they had incentives to abate N2O under the CDM days. Some of those plants that were abating, Rene, turned off.
Really? Just because they lost the incentive?
Because they lost the incentive. So when we went into...
That's perverse.
It's perverse.
But that just shows the power of the climate financing piece. Without that incentive, you just revert back to the mean.
It does. And I think, so we had to really grapple with the fact of, all the plants that we're doing now never had control before. So we were not working with a plant that actually shut one down. Our main focus right now is plants that were built with zero control. But because they were built with zero control, Rene, and they had technology in China 18 years ago under CDM, and they had incentives back then. We wanted to hold China to a North American standard, and we created a mandate that they have a 90% baseline. So when we're controlling N2O in China, a typical plant size is 10 million tons a year or 15 million tons a year of CO2 equivalent. These are big plants. The first 90% of the reductions, we're not even crediting, Rene. So those reductions being built.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's massively important, which is why the ICBCM core carbon principle stamped all of our work. They stamped our China work and they stamped the US work because of that integrity that we built in. We didn't want to flood the market. And we also wanted to bring buyers that were interested in low carbon nylon 6,6. So the first 90% of our reductions gets factored into the life cycle of the product. Anything above 90% is what we're using to finance the technology. And so we've got like 30 million tons under abatement in China right now, and we're moving quick. So, but coming back to the process, you look at those two protocols, and that's 4 years of our lives to create that. But if you think about what we've done with it, it was worth the investment. It was worth it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And but I want to sort of come back to something you said earlier, because it's a really interesting reflection. I don't want to gloss over it unnecessarily. The work that goes into developing these methodologies, the scientific review process, and ultimately when these methodologies are approved, there is huge investment of time and money, right? Effectively for a lot of folks, because you're essentially breaking new ground. But it's really important what you said around, it's no longer yours. Once you hand it over, it becomes a public good. So that enters the market, and that's actually how we create a market, right? It's these novel ideas get then shared more broadly, and then creates a foundation on which, I should say, projects can then be built upon. So that's a really important concept, and I think that's sometimes overlooked in this market. That a lot of these methodologies are developed with really, a lot of passion, a lot of hard work, and ultimately deliver great intentions and results on the back end. And it's not just proprietary. It's not just one company owning it in a kind of monopolistic approach.
Yeah, no, I agree, Rene. In fact, I would say if we really want scale, that protocol be public and transparent, and hopefully used by other people.
Yeah, and it evolves over time as well, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, great. So kind of coming on top of that, now you've kind of given me this broad overview in terms of not only the US work, but then this expansion into China, which is fantastic. And you mentioned you've got 30 million tons of effectively avoidance credits coming in through that pipeline. So let's pivot to the market side. So how is this work being supported from the market side? There's a number of different commitments that are being placed in terms of different proponents in the market around super-pollutants. How does that intersect with this on a material and sort of commercial intersection?
Yeah, good question. And just to come back a little bit to China, we're abating 30 million and we're crediting 3 a year, right? So the first 27 million are actually, we're not crediting, but our projects that are already abating 30 million tons, we're actually, I think in I think in September, we're going to have our first issuances from the 3 plants. That's pretty exciting.
That's exciting.
But yeah, I think, all the work that we've done, Rene, over time, one of the things that we say now is we like to follow the molecule. When I say follow the molecule, that's like a term that we use at ClimeCo. So we want to know where ammonium nitrate is used throughout the supply chain. Where does that go? Who's using it? Why does anybody care about N2O in their supply chain? We want to follow adipic acid. Like I know where it all goes. I know where Nylon 6,6 goes. We know all the users of it. In fact, we have a partnership that was public with the REI because REI uses nylon. And they're using it as an inset. So our demand is not only offsets, but we're also looking at where customers use products that have nylon or ammonium nitrate in them. So we could start looking at, targeting their scope 3 reduction obligations under science-based targets. So this is actually where, we use different incentives, and that's one, certainly. But I think historically, it's always been companies that realize that, we're in a climate crisis and they wanted to make an impact, and they wanted to make an impact immediately. So many of our clients are balancing avoidance with removals, looking at a blended portfolio, looking at the importance of both, because as much as we're talking about super-pollutants right now, I really believe in harmony. I believe that there's a protocol, we need to look at, avoidance, because I think your last speaker on super-pollutants said it really well. You can't draw down N2O when it's in the atmosphere. You can't CO2, right? So I think, but both are really important. But I would say we created demand. We created demand by looking at, who is creating the demand for these products that are creating the emissions, and then working with those customers to say, let's help your brand. Let's make a difference. Let's invest in these projects. And some of our clients, we're very, very focused, Rene, in creating demand through our digital carbon platforms and our Amazon platforms with our climate-friendly products, and in the brands that customers earn, by looking at their life cycle and mitigating their emissions. So a lot of our offsets are moved into the market through digital carbon solutions. And I'm looking at a Lenovo computer, and some of our Nylon 6,6 offsets are used to compensate the life cycle emissions of Lenovo. I mean, we do that on a per computer basis while we're sleeping. We may get an order of computers overnight that, we're extracting a half a ton or a quarter a ton of carbon into the serial number of a computer while we sleep. And it creates a certificate that's affixed to that serial number for a laptop. So our clients want to get involved. They want to differentiate their brand. They want to show that they're a market leader. And there's also an opportunity for them to get an upcharge of the product because it is carbon compensated. So I would say we have a lot of different demand mechanisms. I wish they were clearer, Rene. I wish we, had a market that said, you can accomplish your net zero goals by using avoidance, and removals. I wish there was a bit more clarity to that. We're always, being very vocal and outspoken on the importance of these leading organizations to look at harmony across portfolios. And we wish there was more progress on that, but we're getting there.
Yeah. And that so thank you for that. That insight that you had around the scope 3 reductions and how these super-pollutants obviously a part of these supply chains, and ultimately you gave the example of Lenovo as a real world example of this kind of embedding these insetting opportunities in the real world. I think that's a really exciting area for potential, right? Because it's targeted to the specific emission profile of those businesses, and it's actually helping to invest into their supply chain, helping to obviously make their outputs a lot more streamlined and obviously climate friendly. But it kind of, and I do want to come back to that in a second, kind of to understand a little bit more around how it's evolving from offset to insetting. But I think, your final point is something that I wanted to pick up on. Ultimately, it's been this market is being driven in large part, or it sounds to me like exclusively, through the voluntary approaches, right? So to verified carbon market, voluntary market, and corporate buyers and private sector led effectively. It begets a question that you kind of touched on earlier, right? Within the US context, but more broadly globally, why aren't governments more involved in actually addressing this really important super pollutant problem and mandating it through regulation?
Yeah. I think in some of the areas that we're expanding, Rene, in India and China, they are moving. Let me talk a little bit about that, because I think it's really important to have backstops.
Hmm.
We don't want another Kyoto CDM where the price of carbon goes down and technologies are removed. So I really believe in kind of attacking a problem with multiple prongs. In the US, I think it's clear we're not going to get anything, right? So at least under this administration, probably not the next, because it's going to take forever. So the voluntary markets by themselves are critically important. In China, provincial programs are things that we have to navigate all the time. So we have representation in China looking at what the provinces are doing. Are they looking at direct CO2? Are they looking at other greenhouse gases like industrial N2O? What are they looking at? But probably most importantly, Rene, is working with some of our stakeholders in China to look at creating a regulatory backstop. So right now we're involved in meetings in China where they're looking at putting a regulation that mandates a certain level of N2O control. We're really supportive of that. We really are. People would say, well, why? That could hurt your market. It's necessary. We have to have backstops. Voluntary carbon can fill this bridge, at least partially. We're already abating 30 million tons in China. We have 240 million more tons to go, and we're targeting it all. But the regulation is going to be an important backstop. So we're supportive of that. We're working with, again, NRDC and other stakeholders, to help create a regulatory background, and we're supportive of other market-based mechanisms too, as they roll out. We just want to have a seat at the table as a big investor in that market. I would also say India is very similar. India is a little bit more clear in what they're doing, and we're really supportive of that. Right now, India is not looking at non-CO2 gases like N2O. So there's a market right now why we're in India there's no adipic acid plants in India, they're nitric acid plants, but we're in India abating, but we're also looking at and realizing that, our product has to be fungible. If we're abating emissions early, what does that look like under a cap and trade in India? Similar to what we used to do in California way back in the day under Schwarzenegger when he helped launch it, launch that scheme. But if we're abating early, what does that mean as an investor? Are we going to create a long position of allowances if they're under a cap and trade program? How does this fit into the allowance program, into the offset program? So we design our contracts in these countries with the anticipation that there will be regulation or a cap and trade program that's going to come in. And again, we're supportive of it. I think the mistake in the past is that these markets didn't have backstops. And one day we'll have a backstop, I think, in the United States. By then, I believe that all of the nitric acid plants and adipic acid plants will already have been abated, because we're almost there. We was running out of sources in the US. We were that successful.
And that's great in terms of progress. But ultimately, there needs to be that positive incentive to maintain those processes and that monitoring to continue to go on, right? In terms of that abatement. So that's really helpful, and it's exciting to hear that there's a potential here for expansion across multiple geographies, and you kind of highlighted the India potential. Obviously, China, India, US, huge economies. There's a lot of opportunities there in terms of manufacturing and ultimately those low hanging fruit in terms of the abatement opportunities for there. I want to come back to something that you said earlier around this kind of non-binary look at the world, which I really like, right? Around avoidance or removals, like being removed, in terms of we should be doing both, right? Shouldn't be an either or, it should be a both kind of approach. But let's bring it down to kind of the real world in terms of the work that you guys are doing. When you're working with corporate clients specifically, what are you advising and how are you structuring a comprehensive strategy around achieving net zero? But specifically, what does a serious super-pollutant strategy look like within that broader portfolio?
Yeah, I think so. Part of our business is consulting around and establishing SBTI targets. So we have a really large consulting practice where we always like to say, Rene, we like to meet our customers where they are in their journey. And a lot of that is just creating the baselines, understanding what they can do realistically within their fence line, and then looking outside their fence line, what they can do, and establishing some of their goals, their net zero goals and other goals. So I think being with their client early to work with them and then start to look at where they can decarbonize inside their fence. Sometimes inside their fence, could be some of our process technologies, but then also looking at their supply chain. So really working with them to establish the art of the possible, but most importantly, like what's feasible, because I think what we're seeing right now, CEOs of companies that didn't set their SBTI target are saying, I don't know why they set the target that we did. We can't accomplish that. We need more time. So we saw some unrealistic goals being set that are being lifted, and we want to avoid that. So I think, working with the customer, we have a part of our operations that we heavily invest in removals as well, throughout Asia Pacific as well as North America. We do believe we walk the talk. We have a balanced portfolio where we invest in mangroves. We invest in reforestation at scale. We've got, I think so far, around 15,000 acres planted in Louisiana, ball cypress trees. We're the investor of that. So we really do walk it. And I think, one of the things that we like to say with our clients too is the balance is important, but how do you strengthen your brand? Look at Beyond Alliance, look at JP Morgan's, the Salesforces, our partner Amazon, Google, and others, putting their brand behind action now. It's because when you start to look at that climate curve, it's pretty scary. It's scary. And I always like to look at, some of the statistics and all of the money in lives lost with climate change. It's happening all the time. So customers that realize that say, how can I differentiate my brand? And I know that maybe removals are going to help me get to my net zero, but I want to act now. And if I can do that profitably by embedding that into my products and differentiating my products to the market, fantastic. But I like to say, we have an obligation to act, and whether or not it's optional emission reductions or beyond value chain emission reductions, what I like to see more, Rene, is that companies are really highlighted for using that lever. Let's create customers or companies for doing OERs, for doing beyond value chain, for acting now. Because if we're all going to wait until 2030, 2035 to look at our removals to get to our net zero, we're missing out a lot. Like you and I just said,
completely.
That we emit today, it's in the atmosphere for 100 years. But if we can act now, why wouldn't we? So it's happening though. I think I'm really excited about Beyond Value Chain, or not Beyond Value Chain, but the Alliance. That's at least elevated the topic, and it's nice to see that, and it's getting attention. And those are some leading companies that are doing that.
Yeah, that's great. And I like that framing, right? Like we can't wait because there's not a silver bullet at the end of it, right? And you just highlighted the length and breadth of these processes and getting these methodologies up. The real world reality of actually implementing these projects and ultimately building scale is a hard fought one. Last week we were supposed to have a call last week, but we shifted. I was in Vietnam last week looking at a completely unrelated, but a biochar facility in the Mekong Delta, which we'll have to update on later down the track. But just seeing the implementation of projects in the real world, it shows you how complex these projects really are. Right. It's not just this academic process of like carbon tons and ultimately the trading of these environmental certificates, but the real world implementation is difficult. And then the accrediting process is difficult. And so ultimately that leads to this lag. So if we put our foot down on the accelerator today, there's not a response that's an immediate response, right? The crediting processes take a long time to actually kick in, like you said, in terms of things like baselines, et cetera. And ultimately, we can't just wait for removals to achieve scale overnight. That will not happen. And so we need to do everything to reduce those emissions that are in the atmosphere right now that are obvious. And obviously the N2O conversation is one of multiple different strings that we could pull. But it is really important to incentivize that. So I guess the question is, how do you see those positive incentives actually starting to kind of materialize in the market? You gave us some examples. I'd love to hear some more if you can share them.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that we're really focused on, Rene, is insetting. And I want to be real clear, is offsetting and insetting, but a lot what we do, whether or not it's in nylon.
Why don't you give our audience just a little bit of context in terms of the differentiation between the two?
Yeah, so an offset could become an inset. That'll make it even more complicated, especially a lot because we're reducing emissions at an industrial plant. But if I look at nylon 6,6, I would say, here's a classic example. If I'm an automobile manufacturer and I'm looking at my footprint and I want to start to reduce it, and I have a science-based target goal, I couldn't use avoidance offsets to meet my net zero obligation, but I can certainly look at, to meet my scope 3 target, I can look at my supply chain, all the emissions that I'm responsible for my product. If I'm an automobile manufacturer, I may be looking at all my nylon usage. It's in all my airbags. It's in the car. It's a component. It's a super pollutant component of that overall vehicle. So instead of selling the offset into the market, what we do in a case like that is we actually have an inset certification that we created to really document how this is done credibly for science-based target reasons. But we would start to look at, okay, we would break down where your usage of nylon is. We would understand that component of your scope 3 emissions. And then we would retire that, not in your name anymore. We would retire that against, under a book and claim process, we would retire that at the facility where we're creating it. And then that nylon being sold has that low carbon aspect embedded in it. So we're not selling the attribute separately anymore. We're retiring it against the sale of nylon 6,6. Whether or not the facility buys nylon 6,6 from our abated plants, I would say doesn't matter, because under a book and claim, we can move that to them under that accounting principle. But that's now being surrendered against, so they can't overbuy. They can only buy enough N2O associated with their nylon usage, right? So it has to be proportional. And then once that's documented and we would certify that with an independent agency, that's therefore an inset that can absolutely be counted towards their SBTI scope 3 reduction goal. So again, it has to be proportionate. I always look at it that way. Some of our clients that were buying offsets, 1 million tons a year, well, they may, or whatever the volume is, they may not have that amount of ammonium nitrate or nylon 6,6 or whatever the process is in their operations. They were just buying it because they wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to make an impact, and they wanted to compensate their devices or mitigate their emissions, not necessarily through scope 3 net zero, but they just knew that those were like OERs out there, and they wanted to act. But I see where the market is going right now. We're spending an awful lot of time as a company, probably years of investing into scope 3 mitigation. We even just launched a new AI tool that will break down a product and then look at how we can source supply chain related emission reductions and then source them to our clients. So I think that's where it's going. But Rene, that's small. I still say that's a fraction of our business right now. I think that's where it's going. I think a nutritional label on products and carbon intensity is going to be like a calorie content on food one day. But I think this is a 5 or 10 year deal. So right now we need that offset. We're not embedding more than 1% of our offsets into insets right now, at least in this space. We're also in other spaces like low carbon cement, where that's a little bit easier, where we are selling cement with low carbon attributes. But in ammonium nitrate and nylon 6,6, I would say the demand for insets we think is going to grow, especially in the food and beverage space around agricultural products as insets, but it's slow to move. And we all know these markets take time. We all get excited. This is going to be a market. This is going to create demand, but then we know that the demand trickles. But we're steadfast at this, and we believe in it.
Yeah, but I like that framing, right? Effectively, I agree. I think that that's the direction of travel, but I don't think that it's kind of cannibalistic, right? Where offsetting volume kind of migrates towards insetting. I just see that both of those pots tend to increase. The conversations that I've certainly had and our team's had over the years with corporates is that it's shifting from this very broad kind of scope around like, okay, it's a balance sheet exercise, right? Like, or balancing act exercise where we're calculating our emissions and now we're compensating for them. Now they're getting more sort of deeper into their individual processes, looking as to where they can actually reduce internally and materially, right? And then using this credible approach through the insetting to help to make those material investments in their supply chain. I think that's a shift. And you mentioned, you highlighted, automotive industry. Like there's thousands of different inputs of these different parts. You talked about, Lenovo and computers. Again, same sort of thing. There's incredible complexity within these supply chains, and trying to look at each individual parameter and looking as to how you can optimize that is really interesting. And ultimately, like you said, it comes back down to the climate responsibility, right? Being aligned with science-based targets, but also listening to their clients, and it comes back down to the brand. So that's really interesting.
I think one of the things too, I see, Rene, every day, like we're seeing fires in Spain, and we're seeing fires in France, and we're seeing all this catastrophe. Our largest challenges right now from a permanent standpoint has always been our nature-based solutions part of our practice. I've had 4,000 acres wiped out with invasive species and nutria. I've had, fires wipe out and, we're seeing it all the time, right? So I think when we look at the reversal risks, some of the long-term removal solutions, they're so important, but the removal risks are high. And I think where some of our clients like to balance their portfolio then is looking at the permanence of what we're doing. It can't be reversed. Again, I always say harmony works. So look at a balance.
Thanks for those insights. Really enjoyed our conversation. I thought that was really insightful. I couldn't add anything else to your ending there. But you're welcome to come back on the show anytime. Really enjoyed the conversation. Wishing you and your team continued success, and I look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks for having us, Rene. Appreciate you.
Pleasure.